There is a story that gets endlessly retold in our family. It's about my stepfather Sterling, whom we called Opa, and my son Lucas. When Lucas was just a little boy, Opa was playing with him. At one point, Sterling said, "Opa is a blessed man," referring to his joy at playing with Lucas. Without missing a beat, little Lucas instantly replied, "Yes, he is." For a couple decades after that, they would repeat that to each other. "Opa's a blessed man." "Yes, he is." Their relationship was a mutual blessing. Although the Old Testament ends with the threat of a curse, when Jesus, the Messiah, finally arrived on the scene some 400 years later, his first recorded message begins with blessings. We know them as the Beatitudes. Great things come in small packages, so they say. That's certainly true of the Beatitudes. Over the next several weeks, we want to open these small packages of blessing and consider the treasures of truth they contain. Before we jump into the Beatitudes themselves, let's put them in their context. Just as the facets of a diamond sparkle best against the right backdrop, so the beautiful attitudes of the Beatitudes shine out best when they are considered in their original setting. So let's talk a bit about the Gospel of Matthew. Before becoming a follower of Jesus, Matthew had been a tax collector for the Roman government, and therefore he was certainly despised by his fellow Jews. Jesus came along one day and changed Matthew's life forever. "Follow me," Jesus challenged him. And Matthew did. He dropped everything and followed Jesus. Wow, what a bold choice. But the truth is that Jesus calls each one of us to follow him. You might think, yeah, well, that's different. I can't see Jesus. I can't follow him in the same way Matthew did. But that is exactly why Matthew wrote his eyewitness account of the life of Jesus, so that we can know Jesus and follow him. It would be hard to follow Jesus if we didn't have a record of his life, his miracles, his teachings, his interactions with others, his heart. But we do have that. That's what the Gospel of Matthew is. Why do you think Matthew was willing to drop his lucrative career as an IRS man and follow Jesus, eventually all the way to death? Why would he do that? Well, Matthew was willing to drop everything and follow Jesus because he believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the promised descendant of King David, who would rule forever over an eternal kingdom of peace, righteousness, and justice. Throughout his gospel, Matthew emphasizes the inbreaking of the kingdom of heaven, the rule of Jesus, the Messiah. What does that actually mean? It means that in Jesus, the power of God had come near to set us free from the dominion of sin, Satan, and death, so that we could begin today, now, to live under the rule of Jesus, our eternal King. As the Apostle Paul later wrote to the Colossians, "For the Father has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." Although the kingdom of Christ will not come in all of its fullness and glory until Jesus returns, as believers in Jesus, we already live under the rule of Christ. Well, what about the Sermon on the Mount? Unlike the Gospel of Mark, which focuses on the works or actions of Jesus, Matthew focuses on the words or teachings of Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount is the first and longest of 5 major discourses in the Gospel of Matthew. Although it is long, what we have in Matthew 5 through 7 is not everything Jesus said on that particular day. Jesus spent hours teaching to the crowds. You could probably read what we call the Sermon on the Mount in less than 30 minutes. What we have then is a summary of the sermon, kind of a highlight reel, if you will, a collection of Christ's teachings, which he probably shared on other occasions as he went from village to village teaching. This highlight reel includes some of Jesus' most memorable statements. Even people who aren't acquainted with the Bible have heard some of the ideas from this sermon. Who hasn't heard, love your enemies? Or who hasn't heard the Lord's Prayer, which begins, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name? How about this one? Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I've heard a lot of people use this one. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. And then there's the very familiar golden rule. Do to others what you would have them do to you. And of course, there's the Beatitudes. If the Gospel of Matthew is all about the kingship of Jesus, then some have called the Sermon on the Mount the Manifesto of the King. How are we to live now as citizens of Christ's kingdom as we wait for Jesus to return and establish his kingdom in all its fullness? If you want to follow me as Messiah King, Jesus is saying, this is what life under my rule looks like. The Sermon on the Mount is a concise statement of Jesus' teachings on how to live under Christ's rule in our lives today, in the here and now, in the reality of already, not yet. It's a beautiful vision and totally unattainable apart from Christ. The Sermon on the Mount sets an impossible standard of conduct that points to the necessity of the gospel of grace and the new birth. Only those who partake of God's own nature and who are indwelt by the Holy Spirit through faith in Jesus can begin to live up to the moral and ethical ideals of the Sermon on the Mount. The incredibly appealing but equally difficult expectations of the Sermon on the Mount drive us humbly to Jesus for hope and help in living the truly good life. With such high standards, you would think that the kingdom Christ offered was available only to the spiritually elite. But that is not the case at all. In fact, it is quite the opposite, which is probably why Jesus begins the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes express the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 to 3. Look at the kinds of people mentioned in this prophetic passage, which Jesus actually applied to himself at the beginning of his ministry. We read this in Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory. Now that's an interesting crowd, not necessarily the powerful or spiritual elite. Now take a look at who was crowding in around Jesus as he gave the Beatitudes. We read this in Matthew chapter 4, the previous chapter, starting in verse 23. Jesus traveled throughout the region of Galilee, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news about the kingdom, and he healed every kind of disease and illness. News about him spread as far as Syria, and people soon began bringing to him all who were sick, and whatever their sickness or disease, or if they were demon-possessed or epileptic or paralyzed, he healed them all. Large crowds followed him wherever he went, people from Galilee, the 10 towns, Jerusalem, from all over Judea, and from east of the Jordan River. Now that is an incredible crowd of hurting and broken humanity in desperate need. When Jesus announced that the kingdom of heaven was near, he meant that the kingdom was accessible. The rule of God was now available through the person of Jesus, not just to some elites, to some special holy group of people, but to the mass of raw humanity that was pressing in on Jesus with their desperate crying needs, the poor, the sick, the lame, the blind, the epileptic, the paralyzed, the depressed, and even the demon-possessed. These are the kinds of people Jesus was inviting into the kingdom. The spiritually bankrupt, the sad, the underdogs, the hungry, the harassed, the misunderstood. To all of them, the kingdom of heaven was available, accessible, right here and right now, if they would recognize their need and come to Jesus in faith. To the broken and hurting people immediately around him, the Beatitudes were an expression of the present availability of the kingdom through personal relationship with Jesus. In Jesus, the kingdom was near, at hand, available, and accessible, especially to those who are without hope, who are disillusioned with life, who are disappointed in the world, who are broken and hurting, and who are longing for something better. To such people, the Beatitudes give assurance. What you hope for is closer than you think.